Fáilteó I bhcóide go dtí an webinar seo ag tusach seachtain na Gaeilge. So good morning everybody and welcome to today's online webinar about Ireland's energy transition and how we can avail of the potential that green hydrogen offers. We are fortunate enough to have an excellent lineup this morning with leaders in the field and key figures in Ireland's energy transition, here to discuss the role green hydrogen can play in our future. I am very happy to be joined in the studio by Paddy Hayes, CEO of the ESB, and with Noel Cunniffe, CEO of Wind Energy Ireland, and Catherine Sheridan, COO of EIH2, joining us remotely. This is a very distinguished panel, and I would like to thank each speaker for taking the time to be here this morning. However, before I pass the floor to Paddy for the first intervention, I would like to say a few words from my own perspective. Hydrogen is enjoying a renewed and rapidly growing attention in Europe and around the world. However, hydrogen represents a modest fraction of the global and in EU energy mix, and is still largely produced from fossil fuels, notably from natural gas or from coal. Green hydrogen, however, is produced by using renewable electricity, such as wind or solar energy, to split water into the basics of elements of hydrogen and oxygen, used in the process known as electrolysis. For hydrogen to contribute to climate neutrality, it needs to achieve a far greater scale, and its production must become fully decarbonised, with green hydrogen being the driver. As part of a renewable energy system, green hydrogen could be a versatile replacement for high carbon fuels used in industry, in specific areas of transport, provide flexible energy for power, and even eventually could play a role in heating. There are a number of exciting new green hydrogen projects being developed across the island, and industrious examples of a small community seeking to produce hydrogen for their own use can be found on the beautiful island of Valencia, off the coast of my own county of Kerry. I have taken great pleasure visiting this project, and I hope to do so for many more projects to come all across Ireland. However, despite our competitive advantage with our geographical position, there is no coherent, overarching strategy in place to create a clean hydrogen market contributing to economic growth and jobs, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Without such a strategy in place, Ireland risks losing further ground to competitors. This is a fast-moving space. In the last 2 years, 14 governments have adopted hydrogen strategies, including big economic powers such as Japan, China, France, Germany, United Kingdom, Spain, and Portugal, as well as many of our neighbours in the EU, and even the EU itself, but not Ireland. For me, it's clear, for Ireland to achieve its potential, the government must immediately provide leadership in the form of a hydrogen strategy. This needs to come by the end of this year, and no more about it. I'm interested in actually achieving Ireland's green hydrogen potential. And on that note, however, it is my pleasure to introduce a man who knows all about it, Paddy Hayes, who will discuss the important role the ESB will play in producing, storing, and using the use of green hydrogen to complement the role of electricity. So Paddy, I'll hand over to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your contribution. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Sean. Thanks for the welcome and for the invitation to discuss the potential of green hydrogen in our sustainable energy future. Sean, it's a really important topic, as you've set out, and it's great to be having the discussion here. It's really timely. As I think about this, I think about climate action, and climate action being the challenge of a generation, really. And as we're thinking about climate action, the electricity system has the opportunity to do a lot of the heavy lifting in relation to climate action by decarbonising electricity, first of all, and then by using that clean electricity to drive the carbon out of heat transport in society. And in ESB, with our most recent strategy, which is driven to make a difference, we're setting ourselves the challenge to get to net zero by 2040 via a 2030 science-based target. And that calls out for us three big challenges, and this is really where hydrogen comes into it. Those three big challenges: firstly, generating and connecting far more renewables. Secondly, by making sure that our electricity network is reliable and robust, and it's capable of continuing to operate securely at times of high intermittent renewables, and consistent with that. And finally then, to use that clean electricity to support the customers and the communities we serve, so that they can use the clean electricity then to decarbonise heat transport in society. Sean, you talked about what other countries are doing about this. In Ireland, we have made huge progress. So by 2020, 40% of Ireland's electricity came from renewables. So we know how to use clean electricity to reduce carbon in heat and transport. We've got a network of EV chargers now rolling out through the country. We know how to do that. We know how to build and connect more renewables. We've already gone from a standing start up to about 5 gigawatts of renewables on the island. The challenge, of course, and of course there are more renewables offshore, the challenge, of course, is that renewables at the moment aren't dispatchable. So if all we do is build more renewables, then we're going to end up in a situation where we're producing more renewable electricity than we can use at certain points in time. And we're going to have other times when we're going to need to use that excess and surplus of renewable electricity when the wind isn't blowing. And that challenge, that's where hydrogen comes into it. So the real challenge for us is to find a way of taking that excess clean electricity, storing it, converting it into some fuel, converting it into a different form where we can store it, and we can use it then where it's needed. Hydrogen presents a really significant opportunity in that. It can provide what we think of as the coupling to allow that excess of renewable electricity to be used when the demand isn't going to be there. We can harvest the renewable electricity at times of surplus and feed it back either directly from hydrogen into transport, for example, or feed it back into the electricity system, convert it into electricity, and then use it to decarbonise society. What's really important about hydrogen is that hydrogen allows us to do this at a really large scale. We already have some electricity storage in Ireland. Turlock Hill is a really good example. We've got some success recently in procuring capacity for batteries within day storage. But the key about hydrogen is that it allows that long-term, long-duration capability for storage, that we can take, let's say, 15 gigawatts of renewable electricity at a given point in time, a sort of peaky inflow of 15 gigawatts, and convert it into a smooth output of 5 or 6 gigawatts to make sure that society can use renewable electricity all the time. So it's really great. I know we're going to come to the challenges in a minute, but it's really fantastic that we're having this debate and talking about this now, because this is thinking that we have to do in parallel. There's game-changing stuff going on in terms of right now connecting solar to complement wind on the island, plans in place to bring large amounts of offshore renewables onto shore in Ireland. So right now it's really important that we're thinking about hydrogen, because we're going to need it to complement all of those extra renewables that come onto the system, so that renewable electricity can be used to satisfy customers' demand whenever that happens. So thank you, Sean.
Paddy, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. It's great to see the ESB not only setting targets, but also actually doing a lot of work to achieve those targets and giving leadership in this field. So thank you very much for a very insightful and interesting intervention. Now our next speaker is Noel Cunniffe. CEO of Wind Energy Ireland. Noel has been driving policy developments in the areas of offshore and onshore renewable energy, not just in Wind Ireland, but also in Airgrid previously. And of course, he is the boss of my former assistant, Niall Goodwin, who did an awful lot of work here with me when I was doing the renewable energy file for the EPP. So, Noel, delighted to have you and looking forward to your intervention. So over to you now, Noel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean, and well done. What great job on training up Noel to be the person that he is today. He's a huge contributor to our team and to our entire sector. I've prepared a few slides this morning, if it's possible to share them. Thank you very much. Really, what I'd like to have a 5-minute discussion on is just the opportunity that we have with hydrogen, why it's so important to help decarbonize not just the electricity sector, but the entire island. On the next slide, you'll see that we've had a huge success story when it comes to wind energy here in Ireland. As Paddy mentioned, in 2020, 40% of our entire electricity came from wind energy. It's really an incredible achievement, but that's only the start of the story, and we've a lot more work to do. Between now and 2030, we need to halve our emissions that we produce annually as a country every year from 60 million tonnes down to 30 million tonnes. And in order to do that, we need to rapidly roll out and scale up the amount of renewable electricity that we are producing so that we can help decarbonise all sectors, not just the electricity sector, but also heating, transport, industry, either through direct electrification, like the use of heat pumps and electric vehicles, or by utilising the opportunity that green hydrogen provides us with. What I wanted to do on this slide is just show that we have no shortage of renewable electricity and renewable generation that could be used to produce this. We have about 5,000 megawatts installed renewable electricity in Ireland today, and right now there's a pipeline in development of 10,000 megawatts of onshore wind energy and over 20,000 megawatts of offshore wind energy, all of which will compete to try and provide clean electricity to the island over the next 10 years and make us more energy independent. And why is green hydrogen so important, and why has it gotten so much attention? Well, on the next slide, you'll see some of just the headlines that have been captured here in Ireland over the last year, really, because much more of that attention is now going towards, if you have all of this renewable electricity, as Paddy mentioned, there's often times where we will have more of it than we can actually use in our electricity sector. So what do we do with it? Where do we store it? And hydrogen provides us with such an excellent opportunity to store that energy for long term and to really use it in other harder to decarbonize sectors, not just in the electricity sector. On the next slide, you'll see some of the recent publications that we have done to try and help that story and that narrative along. So we partnered up on the left-hand side with Marai, UCC Marai, the excellent researchers in Cork, to produce our climate neutral future last year, which looked at how we could, as a country, achieve a net zero carbon economy by 2050 and what the important role of renewable energy and hydrogen would play in that. So that study showed that over the next 3 decades, between now and 2050, which sounds like it's a very long time away, but in reality, it'll be here before we know it, we need to have about 25 gigawatts of renewable electricity generation in order to service just the electricity demand needs of us as a society and us as a country, and produce green, clean hydrogen so that we can use that in the hard to decarbonize areas of our society. So that's 25 gigawatts purely for our own capacity. That's before we even get into the export opportunity that we have. In the Endgame report last summer, we showed how we could decarbonize the electricity sector in Ireland in a way that's economic to consumers, and in a way that works technically, and that this could be done by the early to mid 2030s. And we'd be very strong that we think we need a zero carbon electricity system, in particular by about 2035, if we're to be able to decarbonize the economy. And in the Endgame report, it showed that converting our existing natural gas fossil fuel generation to green hydrogen was something that we must do. It is not an option. We know better than anybody in the wind sector that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. So we need a firm source of power generation to be there, and that comes in the form of green hydrogen generation and long duration storage. And then the last report on the right-hand side, Hydrogen and Wind Energy, is a report that we produced with Gavin and Doherty Geosolutions at the beginning of this year. And that really honed in on the hydrogen opportunity for Ireland. It highlighted, as you pointed out, Seán, that we need a hydrogen strategy as soon as possible here in Ireland. And it also highlighted some of the potential opportunities in terms of the startup sectors that we need to stimulate demand for hydrogen here in our country, as well as some of the support schemes that might be necessary in order to deliver that green hydrogen over the next decade. On the next slide, I wanted to focus on something which is quite important, and it's particularly important when it comes to the export potential for green hydrogen in Ireland, because our potential to produce renewable electricity is almost limitless compared to our neighbouring partners in Europe, because of the huge maritime area that we have here in Ireland, and particularly the advantages that we can use offshore wind to try and harness that. But Ireland right now is one of the most expensive places to create renewable electricity in Europe. In that graph on the left-hand side, you'll see some of the auction prices that were found in Europe in 2021. There's a very similar graph for 2020 showing prices consistently dropping. Spain last November produced an auction which delivered renewable electricity for about €30 per megawatt hour. But meanwhile, Ireland in the summer of 2020, our price was €74 per megawatt hour. And why is this important? Well, it's very important because the key factor in the unit of price of green hydrogen is actually the electricity that's used to produce it. So the cheaper that we can produce renewable electricity, then the cheaper that we can produce green hydrogen, and will be a much more attractive offering in terms of export potential, and will be much more competitive compared to other jurisdictions who are seeing these low prices of renewable electricity. So we really are calling on the government to start and to focus on a task force to help reduce the price of developing renewable electricity here in Ireland, to make us, to bring us cheaper electricity bills, to help drive that energy independence that I mentioned, but also to make us as cost competitive as possible with our neighbours when it comes to producing green hydrogen. And then on my final slide, earlier this year, we produced a position paper report calling out the 3 steps that we believe are needed in the immediate term. And I won't spend too much time on them, but really it's about how do we produce a hydrogen strategy for our country as quickly as possible. In particular, how do we stimulate demand? It's not just about producing green hydrogen, it's about where it's used. So we need targets in things like heavy duty transport, in heavy industry. And then the second ask is really about that, how do we produce renewable electricity as cheap as possible? So let's set up a cross-departmental group with industry involved, with key stakeholders involved, focused on halving the cost of producing renewable electricity. And then finally, it's about removing those policy frameworks and those barriers to growth that are currently blocking the development of green hydrogen, or will slow down the progression of green hydrogen. So I won't get into them this morning, but I think these are the 3 asks that we would have in the short term. I'd like to pass you back to Seán now, but thank you very much for the invitation to speak this morning on this very important topic.
Thank you very much, Noel. I think that was very revealing. And I think your points about decarbonising the electricity market, and also in a way that would produce cheaper electricity for consumers, is very important, especially now with the war in Ukraine and the rising prices. So as you pointed out, we have an opportunity. Maybe we can't do it overnight, but certainly we need to get on with it. And I was very pleased to hear you say that and how it could be done. So we will come back to that because we'll have some questions. But up next, we have another excellent speaker, and it's very important, of course, to have gender balance. So I'm very pleased to welcome Catherine Sheridan, who is the Chief Operations Officer of EIH2, Ireland's first green energy hydrogen production company. So, Catherine, delighted to have you, and looking forward to what you have to say, especially with your experience of being in Ireland's first green hydrogen production company. Over to you, Catherine, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Seán. Good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to collaborate on this presentation today. I think as we move towards an integrated energy system for Europe, not only do we need molecules and electrons working together, but we also need collaboration across the entire energy sector. So public and private, private industry, and education facilities like UCC and MARI. And I'll just have a couple of slides here today to talk through, I suppose, why the energy system needs green hydrogen, and then what green hydrogen needs to progress. So on the next slide that I have, what I talk about is the need for net zero 2050 to have systems thinking. Oh, pardon me. There we go, sorry. So we mustn't just think of the energy system in isolation. So we can't think of electricity on its own. We have to think of the entire energy system. So if you think yourself about how maybe you used energy today, did you drive or go on a bus that used a transport fuel that wasn't electricity? Perhaps you heated your home with natural gas. Perhaps as you're, maybe working in construction, you might be using cement that wasn't created through electricity. So we need to think about decarbonising the energy system as a whole, not just electricity first, and then moving on to other sectors. In parallel with this, another way of considering systems thinking is we can't just consider the decarbonisation of the energy system either. We need to consider the energy system through the triple lens of energy security, environmental sustainability, and energy equity. This is how it's described by the World Energy Council. But that energy equity could also be affordability. And as costs increase right now, we really need to consider how we're going to transition in a way that is a just transition for those working perhaps in the fossil fuel industries today, but also the role that energy costs have for all of society. On the next slide, I'm demonstrating how the electricity sector will need green hydrogen. And this was mentioned by my colleagues before. What the 2050 electricity system is going to look like. And the reason I started with this was an awful lot of the time I hear people saying, let's sort out the renewable electricity system first, and then we'll start on hydrogen. But I would disagree with that. I think we need to be working on these in parallel. So when it comes to electricity, absolutely, let's increase energy efficiency. And it's fantastic to see the amount of investment happening in retrofitting. We also need to electrify wherever possible. And when I see decisions that we have made in Ireland in relation to electrifying public transport, such as buses, and private vehicles, such as cars, that's great. Absolutely, let's do that. And let's maximize the renewable electricity we have, both onshore and offshore. Also, local solutions like community solar farms or even solar panels on people's houses. And in parallel with that, let's strengthen the network. Let's give as many opportunities as we can. And that will give us a decarbonized electricity system of the future. But we still need something extra. What about intra-seasonal storage? And what about system services when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining? And that's where green hydrogen can play a role. On my next slide, I'm considering the additional needs for green hydrogen. So again, I would say that not all energy is electricity. Again, to reference that we need to decarbonize the entire energy sector. It's not enough for us to just solve electricity, because that will only get us a certain percentage of the way there. And that's not going to be good enough. For us to limit the impact of climate change on our entire species, on humanity, on the planet itself, we need to decarbonize the entire energy sector. There are heavy goods vehicles, planes, and shippings that cannot rely on electric solutions. The weight of the battery alone would reduce the payload that a truck could carry and make it unsustainable or uneconomic for it to be carrying anything else other than the batteries. I mentioned cement that we desperately need in our homes as we face homeless crises. What we need to do there is we need to provide zero carbon fuel like green hydrogen so that the industries that are really high intensity heat can have a fuel. And then we mentioned about decarbonizing the gas network. There's different views on this, and to offer one, the gas network that we have in Ireland is a 2.7 billion euro asset that all of us as citizens own. This is something that's available to us and could play a key role in achieving energy equity as we transition to the energy system of the future. The gas network is modern. It can transport renewable gases such as biomethane today and green hydrogen into the future. So hard to abate sectors need green hydrogen. On my next slide, I broaden out to talk a little bit about the additional considerations that we need to have when we talk about the energy transition. So energy security needs green hydrogen. For any nerds out there like my good self, there's a fantastic Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland report every year that talks about energy in Ireland, and it tells us where we get our energy from. So we import over 50% of our energy today, and most of it is in the form of imported fossil fuels. Noel mentioned the Climate Neutral Future report, and that talks about the possibility for us, if we access our offshore wind and create green hydrogen, that we can reduce our energy dependency on imports down to 5%. And that's a fantastic opportunity that green hydrogen can enable for Ireland and for Europe. So on my next slide, I'd like to talk about why Europe needs Ireland's green hydrogen. So we have 70 gigawatts of offshore estimated off the coast of Ireland, and that's more than we need. And again, I'm not competing with electricity when I'm advocating for green hydrogen. Let's flood our electricity system with as many electrons as it can take, and let's try and export as many of them as we can through interconnection. Let's then use some of the energy for electrolysis, because again, it has the additional benefits as an energy vector of being handier to store and handier to transport. And then that would enable us to export the wind energy as green hydrogen. Countries like Germany are looking at importing 80% of their hydrogen needs, and I'd like to see Ireland having a role in that. It presents an economic opportunity for Ireland. There's a fantastic green energy supply chain. Companies such as Green Rebel here in Cork are looking to provide the surveying that is needed to provide the data for the offshore wind developers so that they can engage fully in Ireland. The other wonderful thing about green hydrogen is it opens up the amount of our offshore that we're able to connect into the energy system, because it's not solely relating on electrons being able to get onto the electricity grid. So where we don't have sufficient grid strength to take the volume of energy, we could bring it ashore and convert it to green hydrogen for use in Ireland and for export. Okay, so I've spoken a lot up until this point, and on my final slide, I'm talking about what green hydrogen needs. So I've demonstrated on the previous slides, I hope, some of the things that green hydrogen can do for us and what do we need to do to get out of the way of green hydrogen. European and Irish policy should enable the green hydrogen economy. And in fairness, at a European level, the Energy System Integration Strategy and the Hydrogen Strategy of 2020 really set us up for success in this regard. When it comes to what we can do in Ireland, you know, okay, right now we don't have a green hydrogen strategy, but we definitely have a lot of indications around hydrogen in things like the Climate Action Plan of 2021 and the Annex of Action. So it's not like we've been silent on it. But what do we need to do now? Here are some of the things that I think that would be acceptable to many in the green hydrogen strategy. And if we have time afterwards, I'll consider it from our own company in EIH to what we'd like to see happen as well. The first thing we need to do is we need public engagement on green hydrogen so that we can build the social license for the infrastructure. There's just not enough understanding about hydrogen and the wider energy sector because we've focused so much on electricity, and that's benefited us because we've had tremendous success. But if we want to have infrastructure for green hydrogen, we need a public engagement so that we can build the social license for it. Let's capitalize on the offshore wind that Ireland has by creating an additional route to market for the offshore wind by green hydrogen. We have an opportunity to access European funding, as announced recently through the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, through the creation of hydrogen valleys. A hydrogen valley is a cluster where a number of companies and utilities and research institutions come together to create a hydrogen valley that can provide the hydrogen that Europe needs. My last point would be relating to treating hydrogen production like any other large energy user. So, for example, a data center in Ireland can have a power purchase agreement and they can buy green electricity so that they can use it in their data center. We should have similar solutions for hydrogen production so that it has to be from green electricity. But in the first instance, it hasn't any limiters to do it. As we progress, we can move towards saying it has to be additional, but not from the very start. So I think we're at a tremendous opportunity right now to consider hydrogen and come forward with a green hydrogen policy for Ireland that will enable Ireland to play a part, not only in a secure, independent energy future for Ireland, but also playing our role as a European country in supporting Europe to become the first climate neutral continent. So I'll hand back to you, Seán. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you very much. I think most people, including myself, obviously find that most interesting. and particularly the work you're doing at EIH2. Your emphasis on the entire energy system as just opposed to electricity, I think, is very interesting, because many people, unfortunately, when they think of energy, they just think of electricity. And also your emphasis on the potential for Ireland in terms of exporting in due course is so exciting for us, and we can come back to that maybe when we have questions. So now we're going to go into some questions which have come in, and I will start here with Paddy. Paddy, there's a question here for you, which I think you'll have no problem answering, but which is very interesting for us. What are the biggest barriers we face in replacing our fossil fuel-based backup system and integrating green hydrogen and battery storage, as well as demand response, into the electricity system?
Thanks, Sean. I see a couple of challenges and a couple of places where we're already well set up. So first of all, this is going to be really capital intense. In order to create the hydrogen economy or the hydrogen investment, to create the hydrogen and then to be able to use that to create that long balancing out of the system, we need long duration storage, and that's going to be capitally intensive. Now, I think there is a lot of potential for investment out there, people looking to invest in this sort of thing because it's part of climate action, and it's very positive. So there will be lots of people looking to invest here. But the key, I think, for this aspect of green hydrogen for the future is going to be looking at the long term and trying to make sure that that there's an appropriate return on investment for this. So already we can see in Ireland that Ireland's been quite successful in attracting battery storage for that intraday storage, that storage that's needed in order to be able to support the system peak. But if we look forward to 2030 and we think about Ireland's target to get to 80% renewables, the way in which the market works is going to mean that effectively some of the economic signals that would be giving a return to the value of electricity won't necessarily be there. So we've seen some very successful things happen over the last number of years in terms of making sure that Ireland stepped up in constructing onshore wind, for example. We now see that happening in onshore solar. We're about to see it happen in offshore wind. And we need a similar sort of approach, I think, in relation to that long duration hydrogen storage. So that might be something like rewarding capacity, for example, in a particular way. It might be about rewarding dispatchable renewables, that renewable electricity that you can actually control when you supply it, and maybe rewarding that in a particular way and putting a value on the capacity that provides, as well as just costing it currently in the way in which it defrays the cost of carbon or the cost of fossil fuels. So as we're thinking long term, we need to think about where we're going to be in 10 years' time and make sure that the market is going to appropriately encourage that big investment in long-term, long-duration storage, because that's going to be absolutely essential. So for me, that's possibly one of the biggest challenges. Of course, the cost of this, people have been generating hydrogen for many, many years, but at this sort of scale, you'd like to think, similar to what's happened in the wind industry, that as this sort of technology gets deployed on very large scale, that in some way the cost per unit is able to come down over time. You talked about the demand side there as well, Sean. I mean, there's some very nice stuff going on at the moment on the demand side. Certainly the demand side is going to be really important in terms of balancing out how people use electricity and trying to find ways of using electricity when renewables are generating it. And I think the smart metering program that CRU is rolling out with ESB networks across Ireland at the moment will give every energy customer a chance to play their part in the clean energy future. So there's a number of challenges there. The biggest one really is thinking forward to a time when we've got 80% renewables in the electricity system and making sure that the encouragement is there for investment in the same ways we've done for onshore wind, onshore solar, batteries, and now offshore wind.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and that's very clear. And it also, you mentioned about to make sure the encouragement is there. So that brings me to the question for Noel. What do the government need to do to give the needed signal that Ireland is ready to capitalise on its significant hydrogen opportunity?
Thanks, Sean. I completely think that the first step is a hydrogen strategy. So once we know what the strategy is, it'll give a much clearer signal to the market in terms of attracting that investment, which Paddy mentioned. But it'll also set out critically how to stimulate the demand, because we need a domestic demand for hydrogen as well as a potential export opportunity for hydrogen in order to kickstart the market. So initially, that domestic demand might be gas grid injection into the short term, so we can blend about 20% hydrogen into the existing gas grid without any major changes to the gas grid or major capital intensive investments. So that's one opportunity, but then over time it's really around how to stimulate the demand in heavy duty transport. As Catherine mentioned, we can't put a battery on every truck, we can't put a battery on every ship. So firstly, the haulage sector is an area that we should focus on. Then an opportunity for shipping and ultimately aviation in terms of things like green ammonia, which hydrogen is a key component of, and e-fuels, which could help replace aviation fuels. That's maybe the longer term demand stimulation. So once we get the demand sorted, then it's really around how do we produce the green hydrogen as quickly and as effectively as possible. And that goes back to my point around costs. And one of the biggest component of our costs in Ireland in terms of developing renewable electricity right now is our quite inefficient planning system. Our projects on average spend much more time in the planning system than other projects throughout Europe. We need more resources in our planning authorities at a local level, but then also critically at a national level in On Board Planola. Projects for renewable electricity and for electricity grid, the electricity grid infrastructure, as well as even solar projects, they're spending about 4 times longer in the planning system than they should be right now. That leads to a longer incurrence of costs, it leads to more risk. There's a much more uncertain outcome. We have a judicial review system, which means that once a project gets planning, it can then spend the next 18 to 24 months in a judicial review process before it can actually construct. Some projects might fail at that point. All of that needs to be built into the costs of developing renewable projects, which will ultimately feed into the costs of developing green hydrogen. So the quicker that we can sort out our planning system and our grid system, the quicker that we can produce renewable electricity in a faster means to help decarbonise the electricity sector, but then also stimulate green hydrogen to help use that in other sectors like heating and transport in particular.
Thank you very much, Noel, and I can't but agree completely with you on your thoughts about planning. It's something I've been advocating for some time. The long drawn-out process we have in Ireland, and for renewable energy projects, I have proposed a Fit for 55 label, which I think will be taken on board here at European level and will become part of legislation. But definitely, we need to wake up in regards to that. But I'm pleased that the government are listening, and they're supposed to be bringing some new proposals in that area as soon as possible. But that's definitely needed. So now we'll go to Catherine. A question for Catherine has come in here. Catherine, as Ireland's first green hydrogen company, how would a dedicated hydrogen strategy affect the growth of Ireland's hydrogen economy? And what should a hydrogen strategy, in your view, focus on?
Thanks, Sean. So as a long-term environmentalist, I look at this from 2 viewpoints. So first, as a human living in Ireland, about looking to decarbonise our energy system and how can we achieve that. Again, if you fast forward to 2050, we've got 2 energy vectors. We've got renewable electrons, and they're supported by zero carbon gases, and that's green hydrogen. So in parallel with that, I look at what we would need in EIH2 and what the green hydrogen economy of Ireland would need to be successful. And again, it's a green hydrogen strategy. What we need that to look at is how can we decide as a country what we want our energy sector to look like and how we want to get from where we are today to the future. And then we need to put the steps in place. We need robust regulation to make sure all of this is progressing in a successful way. And then really simply, we need to consider how can we stimulate supply and how can we stimulate demand. And I think if we consider the stimulating demand, a very quick one would be to have a blend with the gas network. The gas network is going to be importing an element of hydrogen as part of the interconnection from the UK, and Gas Networks Ireland are doing excellent work in preparing for receiving this blend of natural gas and hydrogen from the UK. So in parallel with that, we could look at injecting green hydrogen into the gas network. That will give us developers a reason to be creating electrolyzers and give an instant demand to it. In parallel with that, it's the creating indicators to the worldwide developers that Ireland is open for business. And we could do that by saying, not only are we going to give you a route to market via renewable electricity and connecting to the grid, but also we could do it by giving you a route to market via green hydrogen and enabling all that other sectors would enable, both in Ireland on heat and transport and industry, but also the opportunity to export. I think as well, the hydrogen policy needs to be coupled with additional support in relation to planning. And this is in particular in relation to things like foreshore licenses that people can apply for the surveying that's needed to get the data for the offshore wind. So if we could increase the resourcing within Ireland for accessing licenses like that, I think it would really help us. And it would also show companies who are looking to invest in Ireland, the Equinors and companies of that ilk, that we are open for business. We're serious about it. And if you're choosing to invest somewhere, invest in Ireland. We've got the resources and we're transitioning to the policy and the processes to really make this happen quickly.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you very much, Catherine. That was very clear. And I like your idea about stimulating demand. We have to stimulate everything and we've no time to waste. So now, in the second question, for Paddy Hayes here, CEO of the ESB. Paddy, how does Ireland's large-scale storage of green hydrogen compare to our competitors in Europe? And Catherine mentioned Europe as well a while ago there. And how important will adequate storage be developing the hydrogen economy?
Thanks, Sean. Well, we don't have any large-scale hydrogen storage at the moment, so this is a really important part of the equation, because if we get to a situation, as we're intending in Ireland, to where we have up to 15 gigawatts of renewables installed between what we've got onshore, wind and solar, and then this wave of really important offshore wind that's going to come from the east coast, fixed, but also floating from the west coast. That's going to give us 15 gigawatts of renewable electricity. In Ireland, even at the peak time at the moment, we use about six-ish. So we have to find a way of capturing and converting that surplus renewable electricity in a way where we can use it when it's needed. And that long-term storage is a real key. And that, as well as making sure that we have green hydrogen to be able to use in places like heavy-duty transport where it's going to be cost-effective to do that. It is this aspect of long-term storage, that long-duration storage of energy in the form of hydrogen that's going to be really, really important. And I suppose I can't stress enough that as we think about what's going to happen by 2030 in terms of the amount of renewables that we're going to have connected to the system, at the same time and in parallel, we have to make sure that we have that storage capacity developed. And that's really important. So we are at a very, very early stage at the moment in Ireland, but it's really positive that we're having the debate. And if I think back to when in Ireland we started thinking about onshore wind, we need to make that same journey that we've done with onshore wind, but we need to do it with long-term, long-duration storage. And that is, without that, well, look, we are going to deliver that because it's really essential in order to fully decarbonise the electricity system. That's what we're going to need to do.
Very encouraging, Paddy. Thank you very much. So now, second question for Noel. Noel, and again about costs. People are always worried about costs, naturally enough. So the cost of electricity accounts for up to 2/3 of the cost of hydrogen. How can Ireland reduce the cost of renewables to compete on price with other jurisdictions?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I think it's probably worth mentioning right at the get-go. I know certainly I've been talking a bit this morning that we are more costly than our neighbours when it comes to producing renewable electricity. But for a comparison, renewable electricity right now is about 2 to 3 times to 4 times cheaper than fossil fuels. So any cost renewable electricity right now is way cheaper than a fossil fuel alternative. And I think it's important that everybody leaves here with that message. When it comes to reducing costs for developing renewables, though, as Paddy mentioned, I think we need to get into a mindset that by 2030, 80% of our electricity will be coming from renewables. So why wouldn't we invest in trying to make those renewables as cheap as possible to produce, to really bring down the price for consumers that we're paying? In 2020, we produced a report called Saving Money, and it set out 10 cost-effective measures that we could do to halve the price of renewable electricity in Ireland. Some of them focused on things like tax measures, some of them focused on commercial rates, which is quite an interesting one. There's been huge increases in commercial rates for renewables in Ireland over the last decade, up by 300% in some instances. A 50 megawatt wind farm today pays about 2.5 times the rates of a 50 megawatt fossil fuel plant, for instance, which really doesn't help in terms of making renewables cheaper compared to fossil fuels. But the two biggest ones are the grid and our planning. So I've talked about planning already, how we need more investment in our planning resources to really speed up the planning process, reduce as much risk as possible, and create more certainty for the investor and for the developer that's carrying forward projects. We'll really see a reduction in terms of the costs of producing renewable electricity if we can do that. And then the other important one is the electricity grid. We need to make sure that we have an electricity grid that is fit for purpose for 2020, for 2030, and for 2040. I know ESB Networks and EirGrid are investing huge sums of money in the electricity grid over the next decade, and that's absolutely vital because that's an investment in our future in Ireland to make us as energy independent as we possibly can be. We have seen huge investment in the electricity grid from, say, the 1970s up to the early 2000s, but since then it's been stalled somewhat. We really need to get back into the mind frame that we need to invest in network, and as a public we need to be supportive of that. It's going to be a real litmus test of who's serious about climate action and who isn't, whether or not they support the grid development. But of course, green hydrogen can offer that alternative where there are parts of the grid where we have an abundant source of renewable electricity, but we can't get it onto the grid or we can't export it to our towns and our homes and our cities. And that's where green hydrogen can come in if we place electrolyzers in the right parts of the country to try and capitalize on that. That can take that grid cost out of the aspect and again can drive down price. And that's one of the real opportunities for green hydrogen for Ireland.
Yeah, thanks, Seán. If I could just double on that for a second. So I think taking Noel's point about the areas where we're going to have deep wells of renewable electricity, it makes me think of Moneypoint. And I think Moneypoint's going to be an absolute classic in terms of showing the transition to low carbon. So Moneypoint in West Clare, which is Ireland's coal plant at the moment, our intention is through Green Atlantic at Moneypoint to convert that from a coal-fired power station, that capacity there, bringing floating offshore onshore at Moneypoint, being able to use the electricity network and the grid that Noel was talking about to export that green electricity, but also then investing in hydrogen storage there on site so that again we can convert that intermittent renewable electricity into a steady stream of renewable electricity to be used by customers across the network as a whole. And just to say in terms of investment, I know that the CRU have mandated ESB Networks to invest about $1 billion a year in the grid, both distribution and transmission over the next 5 years. And my expectation is that that'll go up even further the 5 years after that. So
very good. Thank you, Paddy. And that's again very encouraging because all the talk in Europe now is about developing a European-wide grid, super grid, to connect to all countries, and that will be fantastic. So one question, we were running out of time a bit, as always. So Catherine, question for you. One of the largest barriers to any new technology, not just green hydrogen, is the scaling up process. What, if any, government intervention would be needed to scale up deployment of sufficient amounts of electrolyzers?
So given our time constraints, I'll be quick. We need whole of system thinking when it comes to energy. We cannot seek to be perfect at renewable electricity and then take our head up and look up around and see what else we can do for the energy sector. What we need to do now is we need to look at the whole of energy sector and take steps on decarbonising non-electrifiable energy needs, such as, we've mentioned them, transport, industry and heat. And we need to think, how can we create a hydrogen economy? And we need to start now. We can't wait until electricity is perfect. By doing that, we'll start creating a situation where electrolyzers are going to be deployed in Ireland rather than other places. And at that point, when we have a surfeit of electrolyzers in Ireland, we'll have more opportunities to target it in more particular in the way we want. So we need to make decisions now based on how we can get to a net zero 2050 energy system. And we need to consider what we need to do to support the hydrogen economy, which may mean that we don't have a perfect decarbonized electricity system. And we have to be okay with that.
Catherine, that's very good again. Thank you very much. So now we have to be out of here by past, so there's probably no room for another round of questions, unless maybe I would give Catherine or Paddy or Noel an opportunity maybe to say something that we haven't mentioned that might be important, rather than I putting a question to them. Paddy, is there anything you just want to emphasise?
Thanks, Seán. I just, first of all, welcome the debate. It's really important to be having this discussion now because we need to do this work in parallel. The second thing is, I see this as this is going to have to be a collaborative effort. Energy generators, developers, grid companies, customers, chemical companies, hydrogen companies, like everybody's going to have to come together for the greater good around this. And then just in relation to policy generally and strategy generally, I think when we reflect back on some of the big shifts that we've had over the last 20 years, quite often it's been quite different at the end from what we thought it would be when we set out on the journey. So as we're framing policy around this, having the flexibility to be able to react to changes in technology or to the experiences that we've had when things haven't turned out exactly the way we thought they would, or we see a different opportunity because we've moved further ahead, that's going to be a really, really important part of this. And getting a coalition of collaboration and a mindset of collaboration around this, because ultimately what's it about? It's about climate action, and it's about urgent action on climate.
Thank you very much, Paddy. Noel, you've mentioned the grid, you've mentioned planning. Anything else you want to emphasise right now? You have a minute.
Thanks, Seán. Just to say two things. One, the economic opportunity for this is staggering. We haven't focused on that at all this morning, but the potential for Irish jobs from this is tremendous, particularly around our coastal communities, as we compare this with offshore wind and that opportunity that we have and that we're currently trying to take advantage of. And the second point I want to make is that we need to move on this as soon as possible. The events of the last month have really shown us that we can't take our energy security for granted. We need to try and decarbonise our system as quickly as we possibly can, and making sure that we have a thriving green hydrogen economy is going to be crucial for that.
And Catherine, final word to you.
Thank you. To build on Noel's point, this is an amazing opportunity for Ireland, for our young people who are looking for reasons to be hopeful. We've so much wind, we can use it to support not only Ireland, and while we're doing it and while we're decarbonising our economy, we can have good, clean, exciting jobs for our young people as we move forward.
Thank you very much. So to my panelists, I want to thank them very much. I like doing business with business people because they're practical and they want to get things done. And you have done, each of the three of you and your companies have done tremendous work and shown great leadership. We had over 300 people signed on today. Many of them will have other questions. So if you email us the questions, we can refer them on to either Noel or Catherine or Paddy, and they will answer them for you so that you won't be disappointed. With that, I think we have about 10 seconds left. So thanks to my colleagues here, Emer and Julian from my own team, and Aoife, who've done tremendous work in organising this, the services here in the Parliament, and above all to our three wonderful panellists who were an absolute inspiration. This is only the beginning. Let's keep it going. As you said, Paddy, it's all about collaboration. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Seán.
Thank you.
Slán go fóill.
Yeah. Slán.